Hey guys, Sun here. I'm a privacy and a security researcher and you're watching the Privacy Guides. Today I am super excited to finally share my StrongSwan research with you guys. I've been investing huge amounts of time to figure out how to install StrongSwan and actually do it in a very secure and hardened way, and all of this will be shared today. I've been actually running my own VPN using this stack for about 2 years. That being said, I've been using an IPv4 only implementation of it. And as I mentioned in the IPv6 episode, I'll link to that in the description, if the server is not running dual stack, meaning IPv4 and IPv6, chances are clients connected to IPv6 networks will leak IPv6 traffic. This is something that I really wanted to mitigate. I didn't want to share a guide to you guys that is only IPv4 because I know some of you are actually following this from China and India, and in countries with more dense populations, IPv4 are actually not available anymore, and some ISPs are actually IPv6 only. So the good news is today's episode actually covers IPv4 and IPv6. Now, if you're running this on a hosting provider such as 1984, that is IPv4 only, that is perfectly fine if you follow the steps in the IPv6 episode to disable IPv6 traffic on your Mac. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't apply to Wi-Fi on iPhones. That is why, that's actually another reason why I just don't trust mobile devices for privacy. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump in. Today's episode is going to be very dense. I actually discovered that my camera has a 30-minute record limit because I went through this whole thing yesterday only to discover that my camera had stopped recording, so now I have to do it all over again. Now that I know this, I have a timer running and we're now at 22 minutes, so I'm going to have to pause in the middle and kind of fix things up in the editing process. So the first step is we want to create an SSH key pair. SSH is a protocol that we use to connect to the server remotely. And it's also something that we use to authenticate with that server. So when setting up a server, say we're using Angela or Nihala, or I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Sorry about that, guys. We want to choose a VPS. The base plan here is perfectly fine. We want to select Debian, and then we want to put an SSH public key here. In order to generate this, it's pretty simple. We want to make sure that we have an SSH folder on the computer. We then want to go into that folder, and once we're there, we want to run this command here. Now, when asked for a file name, we want to put VPN server and then go through the whole steps. As you can see, this is what will happen. I already did that first to speed up the process. So if I look at the contents of my .ssh folder, as you can see, I have a VPN server. This is the private key and this is the public key. So when you run cat and then VPN server.pub, this will give us the public key, and that's what I used when creating the server. So you guys, if you want to give that a spin on Angela, you would want to write VPN server here and then add it to cart. What I've done is exactly this, and I now have a server with an IPv4 and an IPv6 address. As I mentioned, in order for this setup to work on mobile devices and actually on all devices, and for IPv6 to not leak, we need to have a VPN hosting provider, a server hosting provider that has both IPv4 and IPv6. Now that we did this, we want to log into the server. So this step here, actually, I need to remove it because we're always going to be using an SSH key. So this here is what we want to run. And then we need to accept this and we're in. Now we're connected as root. So the next step is we want to create an administrative user. We don't want to log in as root ever again. So we're going to be disabling this in a second. In order to generate random passwords, you can either use your password manager or pop open another console window here and just run this. This will generate a random password using OpenSSL. And I'm going to be storing this in a text file because you guys are going to be seeing them, so I don't need to secure them. But you guys should absolutely save those, potentially generate those in your password manager. So this here will be the password for our VPN server admin user. Okay, and so I'm just going to kind of hide this window for now. I'll just leave it here. Okay, so about this here, paste it there, paste it there. All of those other fields are optional, so we're just going to skip them and type Y to create the user. Now that this is done, we want to make sure that we copy the SSH folder over to that user. That will enable us to log in using SSH as VPN server admin. Next, we're going to set up the root password. So in order to do this, we just run that command, and we're going to generate another password here. As I said, this could be done in your password manager for root. Whoops, for root. Okay, enter, enter, and we're done. Next step is we want to make sure that we exit, and then we want to test a login as VPN server admin. Oh, actually, sorry, I need to go to the home folder and then SSH as this. Actually, I'll fix this in the reference material. This here should be using a tilde, so note to self. Okay, next up, we want to upgrade our privileges to root using the su command, and we enter the root password, and now we're back as root. Now that this is done, we want to make sure to disable root login and password authentication in the SSH configuration on the server. Now that this is done, we can no longer log in as root, and that's a pretty good thing to mitigate some security vulnerabilities. Now that we're done with this, we're going to be using the apt package manager. That's kind of the equivalent to brew on macOS. It's a way of installing packages on Debian. But first, we need to update its index files. That's going to help us discover a whole bunch of different packages that are available. And we also want to make sure that we upgrade all of them. So if there were security vulnerabilities that were addressed by Debian or any of the app developers, that would fix it. As we can see, Angela is actually using a pretty up-to-date install for Debian. Now that this is done, we're going to be installing Vim. Vim, as you can see here, was already installed by default, but it may not be the case on your computer and on your server, sorry. And then I'm just going to configure Vim by setting a bunch of defaults. If you guys are savvy, you may not want to go through that process, and you may even want to use another text editor. Next up, we want to set the time zone of the server. So I'm setting time zone to Montreal. As you can see here on Wikipedia, there are a whole bunch of time zones, database names that you can use. You can use the one closest to where you live, or perhaps use a random one or another one just to kind of obfuscate where you perhaps are. Next up, we want to actually save our network interface as an environment variable, and that's what we're doing here. So the interface that we're going to be using, that's the public internet-facing interface. In this case is ETH0, and we want to source it, and that makes it available to this session in the terminal. So a way of seeing this is if we just echo and put that environment variable name here, we can see that that is equal to ETH0. We're going to be using that a lot in scripts later on. Next step, we want to make sure that we install curl and Python. That's going to be used to generate a random IPv6 EULA. Actually, the EULA is kind of like a private subnet that we're going to be using to assign IPv6 addresses to clients that are connecting to StrongSwan. Okay, so I'm going to cut this here and get back to it once it's installed. Okay, curl and Python has been installed. This took a little more time. As I mentioned in the episode on how to benchmark VPS servers, Angela is actually pretty poor on disk I/O, and that is what has impacted speeds of installing stuff like this. Okay, so next step is this long command line here, and I'll take a moment to explain what's going on. This will download the Python script from my website, and then it's going to pipe it to Python, and then it's going to extract the first subnet from its output. Now, all of this is a little delicate. You guys should never run code like this without reviewing it. So a way of reviewing it is actually going to that URL and looking at the contents of the file. Now, I won't do this on camera, but you guys could do this. And if you trust me, you can also confirm the signature of that file using this little file here, eulagen.py.sig. So you can use GPG to confirm that I actually created that file and stuff like this. But for the purpose of speeding up this episode, we're just going to run this. And that has saved this randomly generated IPv6 EULA to this environment variable. We can then source it to make it available to future commands. Next up, we want to install iptables persistent. Now, I can already hear some of you saying, son, Debian 10 is using nftables, not iptables. And you're absolutely true. This is absolutely true, sorry. But I don't know nftables well, and currently there is a way of just using iptables and it's translated to nftables. If you guys are really good on nftables, I would love to receive a pull request to actually convert all of those iptables commands to nftables. So I'm super open to this. But okay, for now we're going to use iptables because that's what I know. So yeah, we're going to save current iptable rules. They're essentially empty as this is a default install. Okay. Now that this is done, we want to run all of these commands. So that's like a whole big block. You can just copy all of them and paste them at once. And once you see that we're at the last one, you press enter. Now, if we were using 1984 or any other IPv4 only hosting provider, this is something that we would run. But in the case of Angela, those commands here are what we're going to be running. So all of this is setting up all of the IP6, IP version 6, iptable rules. Okay, now we want to make sure that we start by exiting the server and reconnect to it to make sure that we then lock ourselves out. If ever that's the case, we could just reboot the computer, the server, because right now we haven't written those rules to the file system, so they're kind of ephemeral. Once we're in, we want to upgrade to root again, use our root password here. And once this is done, we essentially want to save those rules to the file system, and that's what iptables save and IP6 table save does. Okay, now this part here is a little delicate, so please bear with me. When using Angela, I discovered that they were using something called systemd networkd to configure the network interfaces. Usually that's done in a file called interfaces. So you guys have to first figure out if you're using VPS that is using etc network interfaces or systemd networkd. So in order to do that, it's pretty simple. Here we're just going to clear this. You just want to run cat and then put that file. And if it says no such file or directory, chances are it's using systemd networkd. This is our case, so we're going to run this instead of that first code block. Okay. Now we're going to be installing DNS mask, and that's actually a good time for me to mention why we're installing StrongSwan versus WireGuard, sorry about that. So WireGuard is a much simpler way of setting up a VPN server and connecting to it from clients, but there's two reasons why I favor StrongSwan. One of them is using DNS mask, we can detect certificates from clients and statically assign IPs to them. That means that we can start to do much more advanced networking using the VPN. The other reason is I really like the fact that we can install a VPN such as StrongSwan, so essentially an IKEv2 / IPsec VPN on iOS and macOS without requiring any third-party software. So for those two reasons, I am super happy to use StrongSwan, but I mean, WireGuard is something that we should keep an eye on. Now that this is done, as you can see, there's a port 53 conflict. That's totally cool. That's because we haven't configured DNS mask as a DHCP server only. Right now, it's also acting as a DNS server. So by running this command here and by restarting it, that fixes this. So we can actually just type this status DNS mask, and we'll confirm that everything is now running perfectly fine. Okay, next up, we want to install StrongSwan and some plugins that we're going to be using. So we'll see, hopefully this is going to go fast. As I mentioned, there are, disk IO is pretty slow on Angela. All right, so I did pause this again, sorry about that. StrongSwan and libkaren extra plugins is now installed. The next step is we need to figure out what our DNS name servers are on that server. There are a whole bunch of different places where those DNS name servers can be stored. Sometimes, hosting providers will actually supply them in the dashboard, but here are treeways. So if we run this command here, and it gives us something that starts by 127, that is not what we're looking for. That's kind of like a localhost kind of equivalent. Now we're going to try this other command, and that says the file doesn't exist. So as I mentioned earlier, Angela uses systemd networkd, so that is where those things are stored on that kind of implementation. So this here is our name server. So the next thing we want to do is save that DNS name server as StrongSwan DNS name servers environment variable, and we're going to be using this for the next steps. Now we want to make sure that we back up default configuration files so we can reference those later. If the server is IPv4 only, this here is what we would want to run, but given we're doing this on a dual stack server, this here is what we're going to run. Now that this is done, again, we want to back up defaults and override a few files. This is part of the StrongSwan configuration. Okay, and a whole bunch of plugins are actually used by default on StrongSwan, so we're disabling all of those. All right, now this here is a little hack to make sure that things run in the right order. StrongSwan will be depending on DNS mask, so DNS mask has to run first, so that's what we're doing here. Okay, so this is a good time to pause. I only have 5 minutes left before my camera shuts down, so I'll pause here and All right, so I'm back. Next step is we want to create a certificate authority. Now, StrongSwan has a different set of ways of authorizing clients to connect. One of them is using a password, but another one that is more secure is using certificates. It's kind of similar to what we did for SSH using a public and a private key. So in order to use certificates, we need to create our own certificate authority. Now that subject could have its own episode, so I'm gonna plow through these steps. But if you have questions, you can ask them in the comments, and I might create an episode on what certificate authorities are and stuff like this. But we're gonna be running those commands for creating the certificate authority on the Mac. It's safer to not do this on the actual server. So first things first, we want to create a folder on the desktop called StrongSwan certs. Now that this is done, we want to go about registering an environment variable called StrongSwan client common name. Each client needs its own certificate. So at the end of this episode, I'm going to show you guys how to create additional certificates and provisioning profiles. More on this in a second. Okay, so now we want to go about creating our OpenSSL configuration file. Those are a set of defaults that are going to be used throughout the next steps. Okay, now we're going to create our private key for the certificate authority and generate a certificate for it. Now that this is done, we're going to create a private key for the server, and we're going to use it to create a CSR file. And that is actually, CSR file is like a certificate request that our certificate authority can then use to generate a certificate. The same is going to be done for the client. So we're going to create a private key for the client. We're then going to use it to create a certificate request. And we're then going to use our certificate authority to create a certificate for that key. Actually for that certificate request. And the way Apple Configurator, more on this in a second, works, it requires those certificates to be packaged in a specific way. The format that it wants is a P12 format. So once we run this command, it's going to ask us for an export password. And we just use, again, OpenSSL or your password manager to generate that. So let's just put this here, John P12. Boom, paste that again, and we're good. Now that this is done, we need to copy over the certificates that we just created using our certificate authority over to the server. So let's clear this here, and I'm essentially going to run this command here to display the certificate. And on the server side, I'm going to use vim to create the file. So once this is run, you want to press I to enter edit mode, and then we want to copy all of this and paste it there. Press escape, and then capital ZZ to exit, saving the file. Now this is repeated again for the server's private key. Whoops, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm gonna just rerun this. Okay, now this one here, we want to copy the whole thing again. Paste it there, escape, capital ZZ. Now this here is the server's certificate. And we want to copy the certificate. Okay. Now we want to make sure that only root can read that private key. And it's time to restart StrongSwan. Okay, so now that this is done, we have a few more steps on the Linux side to harden things up. First things first, we want to update a few settings here by running this code block. If the server was IPv4 only, such as if we were using 1984, this here is what we would want to run. But given we're running this on a dual stack server, we want to run this instead. And we want to reload the configuration, and this is done. So we essentially enabled IPv4 forwarding, IPv6 forwarding, and disabled some redirects here. Okay, the next step is using Apple Configurator. So if we go to the App Store and type Apple Configurator, you guys would want to download Apple Configurator 2. I already downloaded it, so this here is what it looks like. Now, what we want to do is we want to go about creating a new profile. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of context. This can be kind of abstract. The way Apple in the enterprise side of things configures devices is done using something called provisioning profiles. So provisioning profiles is essentially a configuration file that macOS or iOS can interpret and configure things. Well, that was weird English. So essentially, instead of us writing a configuration file from scratch, we can use Apple Configurator to generate that configuration file for us. And that configuration file will include the certificates for a specific client. So first things first, we want to go about setting the name. This is one of the required fields. Then we want to go into certificates, and we want to add our certificate authority cert. And we also want to add, as I mentioned earlier, the P12 formatted certificates for John. And we need to enter that password that we created earlier. So this here is the password. Now we want to go to VPN. We want to hit configure. And we're going to set, again, this name here for the connection name. And we want to switch that over to IKEv2. The server, that is the actual IP address of our server. So I'll get back to step 31 in a second. But first I need to figure out what my IP is here. Woo, sorry about that. So this here is my IP address. Now for the remote identifier, that is something that is completely made up. So it doesn't need to be a domain name that you guys actually own. I just said vpnserver.com. Local identifier, this is what we actually set up earlier as a common name. So it's John at vpnserver.com. For machine authentication, we're going to use certificate, and we're going to choose our john.p12 certificate. Okay, so this here will be the same. So server.vpn-server.com, sorry, and we want to enable EAP. We want to do this using certificates, using, again, the john.p12. Now let me just double check I'm not making mistakes here. Yeah. We also want to make sure we enable perfect forward secrecy. and enable those two settings here. Now, there is a little quirk. Apparently, when setting this, we don't need to set the integrity algorithm because it's set automatically. But just to be absolutely sure, we'll choose SHA-2 512 and then switch to 256 JCM. And we want to choose the 20 Diffie-Hellman group, and the same applies here. So again, we're going to set this to 512, this, and then switch to the group 20. Now, hopefully I didn't make mistakes here. Then we hit save, and we want to call this John. So we've just created our first provisioning profile. It took me quite some time to figure out all of those intricacies, but hopefully this can help some of you. Now, I will mention that just by recording this guide, it's obviously very overwhelming. Not everyone will want to run this, but hopefully this will help some of you guys who really want to be sovereign set up your own VPN and perhaps learn about how StrongSwan and provisioning profiles work. Okay, so now it's time to add the actual provisioning profile to our iPhone and to our Mac. So let me just start recording on my iPhone here. Okay, so first things first, we want to make sure that we unlock our iPhone and then plug it in to our computer. Now, once this is done, if you open Apple Configurator, we can just close this window. Our phone will appear here. Now that the iPhone has appeared, we can just double click on it and click Add. Then click on Profiles, and then we want to choose our John file here. Now that this is done, we need to switch over to the iPhone, and the profile has been downloaded. So going to Settings, we can see that there's a profile downloaded menu thing here, and we can just hit Install. As you guys know, my password is super shitty here because this is a demo computer. We then hit Install, and we're done. So once this is done, if we hit Settings and go back, we now have a VPN, so we can just go about connecting to it, and hopefully I didn't mess up one of the steps. As you see, there are a lot of steps that we need to go through in order for this to work properly. So crossing my fingers here, boom, we're connected to the VPN. If you go to General and then, where's this? Then go to VPN and hit that little information thing. We can now see that we have an IPv4 that is in the 10.0.2 subnet, and as well we have an IPv6 that was derived from our IPv6 EULA. What that means is if I pop open Firefox and I reload ipleak.net, in theory we shouldn't see my true IP address. We should see an IP from Sweden, and that's where the data center of Angela is. So as you can see, we have an IPv4 and an IPv6, and those are the IPs from our VPS. Now, we also see that the DNS servers are a random set of DNS servers that are assigned by Angela. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, so this has worked quite well. In order to install that provisioning profile on Mac, things are actually even easier. We just want to open that VPN, that StrongSwan certs folder, double click on the provisioning profile, hit continue, install. As you guys know, my password on this computer is super shitty. Yours should be longer, and we're done. Now, if we go back to network, and first things first, we want to enable show VPN status in menu bar. Once this is done, if I click on this and say connect self-hosted StrongSwan VPN, what will happen here is my connection on iOS will be disconnected and switched over to macOS. As I said, a provisioning profile can only be used for one client at a time. Therefore, if you want to connect using your Mac and your iPhone simultaneously, you need to use two separate provisioning profiles. The way I do it is I have a provisioning profile for my MacBook Pro and one for my iPhone. So we're now connected to the VPN. Oh yeah, sorry, I'll just stop the recording here on my phone. I think it stopped itself. Once this is done, if we pop open ipleak.net, and this here runs, we can see that we are in Sweden. Actually, my ISP here at home does not have IPv6 at all. So this has actually empowered my computer to use the IPv6 internet. So that's pretty sweet. I'm really happy things work out here. So we only have one thing left. Let me see where we're at. Yeah, so we only have one step left, and that's how to create additional provisioning profiles so that we can use multiple devices simultaneously, or perhaps invite family members or friends to our self-hosted VPN. So that is pretty easy. It does require a tiny bit of work. We need to start by going back to step 24. Let me see, step 24. And we need to start by, where's that window I had for, yeah, here it is. Okay, so we need to start by setting that environment variable for another user. So we just replace John by Alice, enter. Now we want to update our OpenSSL configuration file. Okay, and then we want to make sure that we generate a certificate for the client. So now those steps, we need to replace John by Alice. So in order to do this, I recommend using a text editor. Now this one is a markdown text editor, but you could, use essentially any one you want. But you want to paste all of those commands in, and we want to mass replace John by Alice. Doing this in the command line thing, it's kind of a pain in the butt. So John, okay, and we want to replace this by Alice. Replace all, done. Okay. Oh, actually, all except this one here. So this here, we're going to want to create a separate password for Alice. Okay, so now we want to create a private key for Alice. We then want to generate a certificate request for Alice. We then want to ask our certificate authority to issue a certificate for Alice. And now we want to create that P12 format file for Apple. Whoops, let me see. What did I do here? Alice CRT, Alice key. Alice CRT. I think I messed something up. Okay, no, good. So we want to run this here. And now we need a password, so we can use this OpenSSL thing or your password manager to generate a password. And we're going to put it here. Whoops, and use that to generate this file. Now we want to open that certs folder, so you can just type open space dot and duplicate that provisioning profile and call it Alice. Now that this is done, if we drag it over Apple Configurator, we can then configure it. So if we go to certificates, those are John's certificates. So we want to remove John and we want to add Alice instead. Now, as we did before, we need to use that password here. And then if we go over to VPN, once we did this, the certificate for John, oh, actually we need to change the local identifier to Alice. And as we'll see here, the certificate is corrupted because we changed it. It's no longer present, so we need to switch that over to Alice. Now let me see if there's another place that this is referenced. Certificate, Alice. Yeah, we're done. So if we hit save, it's done. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open preferences, system preferences, go to profiles. I'm going to remove John's profile that we added earlier. And I'm going to install, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do, sorry about that. And I'm going to install Alice's provisioning profile instead. Again, sorry for the shitty password, demo computer. And once this is done, we can go about connecting. And now this should work. And we should be able to now use the VPN on iOS and on macOS simultaneously. So if I go here on iOS, I won't show this at the camera. I'm just going to confirm I'm reloading the ipleak.net test. Actually, I need to disconnect first because, as I said, things can get a little quirky when we're using the same provisioning profile. Okay, so we're gonna reload this here, and I'm doing the same thing on iOS. And this here is currently loading, and we can see that we're in Sweden, and on the computer we can see that we're in Sweden as well. So that's it. Hopefully this is going to be helpful to others. I know I've spent hundreds of hours trying to figure out how to do this kind of stuff on servers. It's overwhelming, and it was incredibly overwhelming to me at first, but I can now go through those steps in about 10-15 minutes to set up my own server, and I can then use a server at 1984 or Angela to host my website, host my own private VPN. I can also use this, as I mentioned earlier, using DNS mask to assign static IP to different servers I have. Say I have a hypervisor at home and it's behind a dynamic IP address. I can then use the VPN to route public-facing resources to that hypervisor. More on all of this in future episodes as we start digging deeper into server stuff. And before going there, I am going to switch back to content that may be interesting to a broader audience. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you're happy with this stuff. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.